Hey guys, sorry I'm a little bit late. I was having some technical issues. Welcome, welcome. We're going to be talking about World War I tonight. I didn't put any notes in the information because you can just take notes as you're listening. So welcome in. When you get here, drop in and let me know who's here. We're going to be talking about World War I tonight. And if you've already heard, I'm sure you have, we're out of school tomorrow. So no SAQ for my kids. I bet they're going to be excited about that. But you can put your reading questions in Google Classroom and drop those in there, and I'll just grade your reading questions. Hey, Ethan, how's it going? So we're just getting started with World War I. As you all know, there's no school tomorrow until the 31st, so a little extended vacation for us. We aren't sure yet about any of the guidelines that they might have us like teach long distance. We're not sure about that. So just stay posted for that. Stay posted to your teachers' reminds and all of that. Hey guys, welcome in. We got Andre, we got RX Meshki and Abel. Abel. Nice to see you. Yes, let's study. Okay, so here's the deal though. If you are one of my kids or HISD kid, I don't know that the AP test is going to be postponed any further than what it already is. So definitely take spring break, relax, and then I will be posting some videos the week after for sure, regardless if they're required or not, just so that you guys can stay up to date. Because when we get back to school, if we don't have to do any like long distance learning or whatever, we're not going to have a lot of time to waste. So just kind of keep up to date on that. Make sure that you are checking your email and making sure what we have to do. Like I said, we have not heard anything yet, so we're waiting on word on that. But either way, you get to sleep in tomorrow. Isn't that exciting? All right, so let's talk about World War I. The reason I'm doing this live this way is because when I was looking over Chapter 7, it's huge. There's a lot in that chapter, and I did not want to have to go over World War I and World War II all in the same video, so we're splitting them up for you guys. All right, so let's start with causes of World War I. Of course, you have the main causes. Remember that acronym, MAIN, okay? This is the easy way to remember it. M stands for militarism. Militarism is basically the buildup of militaries and that competition to try to get the biggest military. That's the first cause. Then the A stands for alliances. Alliances is friendships between countries. Secret alliances are a big problem because secret alliance, nobody else knows about them, right? So when one country goes to war, they have to have the other countries back. And that's what starts pulling in all of these countries during World War I. Then the I is for imperialism. Imperialism is the competition for colonies and resources. All right, that's a big cause for World War I. And N would be nationalism. This is the love of your country, but kind of taking it a step further and really, really wanting to get behind your country. This will cause independence movements from imperialist nations. All right, so that's part of nationalism that's important. This is actually what kind of drives the spark that starts World War I. All right, remember we talked about the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand is the spark. Well, that was because the Serbs wanted independence from Austria-Hungary, and they were driven by nationalism to try and get that independence. And so that is basically like the spark that kind of starts all of this. So basically they are seeking self-determination. Self-determination is one of your vocab words. You need to make sure and write that down. This is the idea that if you are within the same ethnic group, the same language, culture, political ideas, that you should rule yourself. That's basically what self-determination means. And that's driven by nationalism. All right, RX says, are partisans one of the secret alliances? Not necessarily. So are you talking about like the rebellion groups, like the Serbs, the Black Hands, those kind of groups? Is that what you're talking about? Or are you talking about partisans that would fight during the war? That's what I need to know. All right, so we have the spark then. So we have these main reasons, and then the spark is the assassination. That starts everything, because then Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia comes to the aid of Serbia. Germany kind of is aligned with Austria-Hungary, and so they come to their aid. They declare war on Russia. Britain will then declare war on Germany, so it pulls them in. Austria-Hungary will declare war on Russia. Japan will join in 1914, and the U.S. joins in 1917. There are some other countries here and there that join as well. So it eventually is going to become this world war based on these four things and that spark that lights the match. All right, so that's World War I, how it starts. Now, there are definitely some social changes that are really important during this time frame. So how does all that take place? Well, for example, women start to go to work in factories, and so they're going to start to gain a little bit more independence. When all the men go off to war, the women have to help with the war effort. There's another vocab word called total war, and we'll talk about that here in a minute, but basically, all of their resources are going towards the war, and the women are part of this. The women have to help in the war effort. If you're talking about fighting during the war, RX, that would just be that they are fighting against the other side. It wouldn't have anything really to do with alliances. The partisans would be fighting towards the side that has their interest in mind. Okay, where the women are trying to get the right to vote starts in 1848. So that's already going on. However, this newfound independence from World War I kind of pushes the suffrage movement forward even further, and it kind of gives them a new fervor for this, because now they're increasingly participating in the war effort, and they feel like they should be able to participate in government as well. Also, women are going to serve on the front as nurses. They will be ambulance drivers. They will be switchboard operators. They're definitely participating in the war other than just on the home front. And this is interesting. I did not know this. I found this out today when I was researching this. Russia, Serbia, Romania, and Bulgaria actually allowed women to fight in their military. So there were branches that were just women in those militaries. So that's something else as far as social change. Now, after the war, women will have this sense of independence. They don't necessarily want to go back to their old lives, and that will push them harder to fight for women's suffrage. Also, as women are fighting for women's suffrage and they're getting put in jail, the men who were against it thought that that would stop them from fighting. But in fact, it just increases their want for this right to vote. And so it actually does not stop them from doing that. It just empowers them more, you could say. Men during the war, they, of course, are fighting, and the new technology causes severe PTSD when the men return. Unfortunately, that often goes undiagnosed because they really don't know what's going on with that. It's called shell shock at the time, and they just don't really understand it. And so a lot of men that are coming back from the war suffer greatly from that. And it's hard for them to go back into society. All right, we talked about when you guys came down for trench warfare, how the war was conducted. We have trenches several miles apart. In the middle, it's called no man's land because no man wants to be in that area. And this is because of all the new technology. We have poison gas, we have machine guns, submarines, airplanes, tanks, all this new technology that really destroys people quickly, and therefore they needed protection in the trenches. As you remember from the trench warfare activity that we did in the Learning Commons, it was not a good way to live. Remember, they would get trench foot, and that's basically where their foot is rotting off because they're in mud and water too long, and several things like that. There's disease, there was animals and lice and rats, and it was just horrible existence. And the war drug on for a long time. They thought this war was going to end quickly. However, it did not. All right, then we need to mention a little bit about why the U.S. enters the war. There are a couple of different reasons. The U.S. had economic ties with the Allies. Those would be Great Britain. At the time, we also have Russia on the Allies. And so the U.S. has economic ties with them. And so that kind of like pulls them in on that side. But then as well, there was something called the Zimmerman telegram. The Zimmerman telegram was actually my word of the day on TikTok. If you don't follow me on TikTok yet, make sure and hop on over there. It's Time Machine Teacher on TikTok. I do a word every day. And today was Zimmerman telegram. Zimmerman telegram was a telegram that was intercepted. It was from Germany to Mexico. And Germany was promising to support Mexico in fighting the U.S. for the territory that the U.S. had taken from them if Mexico wanted to do it. Unfortunately, Mexico was kind of struggling with their own revolution at the time, and they couldn't really do it. And they also didn't get the telegram. The U.S. intercepted it. So that was something that kind of really upset the U.S., that the Germans would go behind their back and do something like that. Also, the Germans were attacking passenger ships with submarines. That was a huge problem as well, especially when they sank a passenger ship called the Lusitania. The Lusitania had several U.S. passengers on it, and that was kind of like the last straw. The U.S. was like, hey, Zimmerman telegram, Lusitania, we're going to come in on the Allies side. And so that's what pulls them into the war. All right, and then at that point is when they go to this total war, where all the resources are going towards the war. Food is rationed, production quotas are put in place, and more production is required on the home front. Also during this time, they start putting out more propaganda to support the war. They're trying to get more and more people to sign up to go and fight. And so you will see all sorts of propaganda if you look it up against the enemy, where the enemy is demonized in the propaganda. And, you know, if you're not preserving things, if you're not rationing your food, if you're not preserving your gasoline, then you're helping the enemy. And basically that's what the propaganda would say and do, and try to get people on the home front to either join the war effort or to ration better. All right, so that's that. Then we also need to talk about how this affected the whole world. This was not just a war in one or two places. This was a global war. Remember, in imperialism, we have colonies that belong to the mother countries all over the world, right? So there's these colonies all over the world. The colonies also got involved in fighting World War I on the side of whoever was colonizing them. So that's important to remember. For example, the British will take over German colonies in Africa. Japan takes over some German colonies, the Marshall Islands. Colonial forces would definitely fight for the ones who colonized them. All right, we also need to mention the Armenian genocide. This is something that takes place during World War I, kind of like near the end. So what's going on is we have the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is nicknamed the sick man of Europe because it has a declining agricultural economy and very few exports. So there's a group called the Young Turks, and they want to reform the Ottoman Empire and kind of bring it into the future. They have this idea that they want to Turkify the empire, basically bring everyone under the umbrella of being Turkish. So the problem is that Turkish people are mostly Muslim, but there's also a group that live in the Ottoman Empire that are Christian, the Armenian Christians. And that's going to be a problem for them to become Turkified. The Young Turks also blame the Armenians for the economic downfall, and they try to turn the public against them. So as a result of all of this, in 1915, the Ottomans are defeated by the Russians, mostly due to poor leadership. However, they blame the Armenians, they disarm them, and they start to kill the Armenians who are in the military. Then they also go to Armenian villages and carry out mass killings. The Ottoman Parliament will then pass an official deportation law that says that the Armenians have to leave and they have to be deported. Many of them die on the march out of Turkey and out of their villages. And those who did survive were put into concentration camps. What's really interesting about this is that even today, the Turkish government denies that this was a genocide because they said that it was never like supported by the government. Like this, the government never said you have to kill all the Armenians, but that's kind of what happened. I mean, they were basically forced out. And so there are others who say, no, this is a genocide, even though the Turkish people, the Turkish government, that is, will not claim it as a genocide. Hey, Aryan, how you doing? Good to see you in here. All right. So that's a little bit about what's going on in the Ottoman Empire. Also, there are some external struggles that affect the Ottoman Empire, and that is that the Turks resent the Europeans because they made some investments within the empire, and that gave the Europeans some power. And they feel like the trade deals are unfair. And so as a result, instead of joining the Allies in World War I, they join up on Germany's side. After the war, though, their empire is split up. So after World War I, the Ottoman Empire is no more. In 1923, as a result of being split up, the Republic of Turkey is established. And this is when there's a guy named Mustafa Kemal. He takes the surname Ataturk, which means the father of the Turks, and he runs a new national assembly. He's pretty good with his reforms. He actually puts in place public education for both boys and girls. He says no more polygamy. He gives women the right to vote. He changes Turkish dress from Turkish traditional cultural dress to Western clothes. But regardless of these reforms, he still serves as a dictator for 15 years. Sorry, it's been a long day. I'm like stumbling all over myself. Anyway, so he does bring about these awesome reforms, but he is still a dictator, which is an interesting comparison. All right, so that's what's going on in the Ottoman Empire. We also have the Spanish flu going on. Okay, we're all aware of what it's like to have a pandemic and to be worried about a disease, right? I mean, we're kind of going through it right now with the coronavirus. It is different than the Spanish flu. However, the same type of feeling and paranoia is spreading. I went to Walmart tonight and couldn't get any Kleenexes. They were all gone. So anyway, apparently everyone's buying Kleenexes and toilet paper. So Spanish flu, causes and effects. Well, basically, the Spanish flu comes from Europe, returns and spreads around the world with the armies that are returning from World War I. It was the deadliest pandemic in history, and there wasn't a vaccine. So the men that were coming home were just spreading it all over. Hospitals are overloaded with the sick, and businesses were shut down. It killed 20 million to 50 million people. So definitely not a good thing. It kind of happens like right near the end of World War I. It definitely hurts the economy. However, the economy was already struggling from the war. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about the in-between years, in between World War I and World War II. During this time, there are some downfalls of monarchies. Russian, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Ottoman Empire. They all go away as far as monarchies go. The maps are redrawn in Europe and the Middle East, and some people are not very happy about that. Germany lost overseas colonies. Britain and France, they take control of Iraq, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon. This will eventually lead to the end of colonialism. Not right away, but eventually. New technology, so this was one of the most deadliest wars. It also leads to the rise of fascism, communism, more revolts, genocide. There's this shift in power from Europe to the U.S., so the U.S. becomes a little bit more powerful from this. Germany is punished from the Treaty of Versailles, and they're forced to take the blame and pay reparations. This happens at the Paris Peace Conference. So let me tell you a little bit about that. The leaders of the victorious countries met at the Paris Peace Conference. We have Woodrow Wilson. He was from the U.S. We have David Lloyd George from Great Britain. We have Georges Clemenceau. Let me spell that for you. He's from France. Let's see here. There we go. He's our French guy. And then we have Vittorio Orlando from Italy. So these four get together and they're trying to decide how to make peace, basically. They're talking about what to do. Italy will end up leaving the conference because they did not recently went through a communist revolution, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. Wilson's idea is peace without victory. Basically, no single country should be punished or rewarded. He wants France to be protected from Germany because he feels like they need that. And he also wants revenge on the Central Powers. Clemenceau, I'm not exactly sure how to say his name, the French guy, he disagreed with many of Wilson's points, but Wilson pushes his points forward in what will come to be called the 14 points. The 14 points starts what's called the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was this group of nations that were technically supposed to get together and talk over problems so that future wars could be avoided. Unfortunately, the U.S. Senate voted against joining it, so they didn't even want to join something that their president had started. Germany, as we know, is going to be severely punished in the Treaty of Versailles, and this is going to cause problems for them later. Also, coming from this time frame that we're talking about, we get the mandate system. Okay, this was discussed during the peace conference, and this was a way to rule the colonies that were formerly owned by the Central Powers. Basically, what was going to happen is the Middle East is experiencing upheaval due to the Ottoman Empire being broken apart. Arab countries are upset because they were promised freedom for helping fight the Allies, and they don't get it. So we have Pan-Arabism, which starts, and that is calling for this unity between North Africa and the Middle East. And then in 1917, the Belfour Declaration is made. And that's where the British say, hey, Palestine, the Jews really need a homeland, and they want to come back to Israel, which Israel is Palestine. They're the same place, they just go by a different name. Arabs call it Palestine, Jews call it Israel. Long time ago, remember we talked about the diaspora where the Jews were completely kicked out of their homeland. Well, they want to go back, and the British supported that. So they tell the Palestinians, hey, you have to get out of that area and let the Jews move back in. This is going to cause a huge problem, eventually lead to a couple of wars. Still a problem today, even in the world that we live in, because basically the Jews went in, kicked the Arabs out, and now there's still, conflict about who actually owns that area. So that's when this is all going to start. In India, we have the Indian National Congress that's formed, and this was basically a place for the Indians to share their grievances with the colonial government. This is around the time in the 1920s that Gandhi is going to start his protests. And basically, he's calling for people to participate in civil disobedience, which is to break unjust laws and serve the jail time in order to get across to the British that they want to be independent. One of the ways that he does that is he goes on what's called a salt march. The British had monopoly on salt, and they wanted to keep that monopoly. So they made it illegal for the Indians to make their own salt. And to oppose that, Gandhi went on a march to the sea where he picked up some salt in protest to the British. So all of these things that we just went over, they're all happening all around the same time. I mean, the world is just in chaos after World War I. Then we also have the Russian Revolution. We haven't even talked about that yet. That happens near the end of World War I. It actually pulls Russia out of the war because the Tsar is taken by Lenin and the Bolsheviks. He's forced to abdicate the throne, and eventually him and his family are killed by the Bolsheviks. and communists come into power. So let's talk about that a little bit. So before the Russian Revolution, during World War I, Russia definitely has some internal struggles. They're trying to industrialize, but they're very slow at it. They're slow at building roads as well. They're slow at like promoting this industry. The Tsar really doesn't want political reform. He doesn't allow the citizens to participate in government and doesn't feel that he needs to allow them to do that. So here are some events that lead up to the Russian Revolution. On January 22nd, 1905, we have what's called Bloody Sunday. And this happens in front of the Winter Palace. If you ever get a chance to go to St. Petersburg, it's an amazing, amazing city. I enjoyed going there so much. The Winter Palace is now a museum that you can go through, and it holds a lot of Russian artifacts as well as artifacts from around the world. But Bloody Sunday happens right in front of the Winter Palace. All right. And basically, workers march to the Winter Palace. They're asking for higher wages and better working conditions. They also want universal suffrage. The Tsar's troops shoot, and around 1,300 of the marchers are killed. Now, the marchers went there peacefully. They did not go there to shoot or to start a battle. And so this was a huge, big deal because it was looked at as, hey, your troops fired on unarmed men. Not a good thing, right? So that's one of their internal struggles. Another internal struggle happens in 1905. It's called the Revolution of 1905. This is when strikers respond to Bloody Sunday. There are around 400,000 people who went on strike and refused to work. The Tsar tries to appease them a little bit, but he also has some of them arrested and killed and some exiled. So it's kind of a big mess. Then we also have some external struggles that Russia is dealing with. The Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905. This was an argument of who would control Korea and Manchuria. And Japan wins, all right? And this is the first time that an Asian country defeats a European country. So it's kind of a big deal in the Asian world. And then also, as an external struggle, as though all of those things weren't enough to give Russia problems, they're also a part of World War I. And remember, we have total war, so everything is going to the troops at the front. So the people on the home front are really suffering during this time because there's huge food shortages and it's just bad conditions. So all of that leads up to 1917 when the Bolsheviks go in, capture the Tsar, make him abdicate, and they take over the government. Now, remember, communists are supportive of everything being collectively owned, right? So Lenin is going to bring in some changes. Let me spell his name for you up here. He's going to be the new guy on the scene. And he's going to bring in some changes into Russia. Some reforms. Basically, one of his reforms is to redistribute land and try to improve working conditions. So he works on that through an economic plan, and he does a pretty good job at it. However, then he dies because he's older. And so Stalin takes over in 1922. All right, so Stalin starts what's called the 5-year plan, and he starts this in 1928. He basically gets rid of the plans that Lenin had, and he starts his own. Part of the plan was to collectivize farms. Now, that basically means that everyone would give up private ownership of land. You would all farm together, and whatever you harvested, you would give that to the government, and then the government would redistribute it equally so everyone would have enough. That's really the theory of what's supposed to happen, all right? So he's basically transforming traditional agriculture in the Soviet Union. He's reducing the power of the higher-up peasants. They were called kulaks or kuluks. This is how you spell it. These are the higher-up peasants who own the farms, and he's basically wanting to reduce their power and take that away from them. And he forces individual farms to join a collective, and everyone work together. The process is undertaken at the same time that they're trying to rapidly industrialize the Soviet Union. So he really needs collectivized farming to work because he's got all these industrial workers that are urban that need the food from the collective farming. All right. At first, the collective farming is voluntary, but by 1929, he steps it up a pace and he takes harsh measures against those who do not want to collectivize. For example, if you didn't collectivize, your land would be confiscated. You might be arrested. You might be deported to a gulag, which is their form of like a work camp or a concentration camp. And the peasants, of course, they are definitely not liking this, and they resist by killing their lands, their livestock, and by also destroying some equipment so that it can't be collectivized. All right. This is going to put collective farms at a huge disadvantage because they don't have the livestock and the equipment in order to continue. So as a result, production of crops fall, and the government is concerned because they need to have these crops, right? And at that time, Stalin kind of goes on the offensive, and he blames all of this on local officials. And he says, well, they're the ones that were too harsh on you. They're the reason that all of this is happening. But he continues to try to push this collectivization through, okay? And it's eventually going to cause major famine in the countryside because they're taking all the crops to the city to feed the industrial workers. Millions are going to die from this. One of the hardest hit places was the Ukraine. Ukraine, after World War I, wanted to become independent. And they actually did for a little while. But then Lenin drew them back in to Russia because Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe. And he knew that Russia would need their grain and their crops that they grow. So he kind of brought them back in under Russian control. They fought, and his army won. And then he kind of tries to appease them a little bit because he knows that their stuff is needed by Russia. So he allows them to keep their own culture. However, when Stalin takes over, he wants more control. And he also doesn't want them to try to seek independence again. And so he forces change. He wants to crush their independence, and he arrests scholars and scientists and cultural and religious leaders and accuses them of planning a revolt. He takes them away and sends them to prison camps without even giving them a trial. And at that time, he's also begins to impose collectivized farming on Ukraine. He did away with the wealthy farmer class because they also had these people. And the people are going to resist this. He shuts down the rebellion, though, by proclaiming that all foodstuffs be sent to the Soviet Union and that it needed to be sent on an increased proportion. More needed to be sent. So basically, he causes a man-made famine in the Ukraine, and it's called the Great Ukrainian Famine. Now, he, of course, argues that, no, this is not a famine. I'm not forcing this. But he was basically taking all the food from Ukraine that they grew and taking it to the Soviet Union and not letting them have any. The wheat crop of the Ukraine funded the 5-year plan, basically, of Stalin and helped build his military. So this is where it gets really crazy. Special agents were sent from the Soviet Union to go into people's homes and look for food that they were storing and steal it and take it. Like, that's how much he was trying to keep these people from rebelling. If they're starving, they can't rebel. And that's what he was doing to them. They begged Moscow to send relief, and the Soviet Union closed the borders with Ukraine and would not allow food to enter in. And during that time, the Soviet Union, of course, is still denying it. And they're still saying, no, there's no famine, there's no famine. And because they're denying it, they won't let outside assistance come in either from any of the other countries. They actually had food stored in open areas, like big piles of potatoes that were wrapped around with barbed wire so that people couldn't get in. And if they tried to get in and get any of those potatoes, they would be shot. That's how crazy this all is. Like, it's crazy. Basically, they were storing it like that while it was waiting to go to the Soviet Union. Animals, of course, were needed to produce this food, so they did feed the animals. They just didn't feed the Ukrainians. So I was reading this today. I couldn't get over this, because Stalin is going to be on the side of the U.S. and Great Britain. And so it's really interesting that they overlooked what he was doing to his people, but Hitler is, the bad guy for doing what he did to the Jews. Now, I totally agree with that, but I also agree that Stalin was not doing right by his people either, and he never really got painted badly in history. However, now historians are uncovering so much more about what actually happened, and he's getting a little bit worse rap because of what was going on at that time. All right, so after the harvest of 1933, the famine starts to subside. By that time, 25% of Ukrainians' population had perished, and he starts sending in Russian settlers to repopulate the area. So it was so drained of people that he's sending in Russians to go and try to repopulate that area. Another thing that Stalin does is called the Great Purge. And basically, this was a time where he had closed trials of any Bolshevik that went against him. And he had the secret police interrogate them before the trials. They were found innocent, but they made up evidence against them. Basically, he just kind of went crazy thinking everyone was out to get him. Some of them might have been, but maybe some of them weren't. And he ends up sending them to the gulags in Siberia or to execute them. Some of them are also imprisoned. And so this is all going on right before World War II. Because 1933, when the famine ends in Ukraine, that's the same year that Hitler starts to pass laws against the Jews. So just to give you kind of like a time frame overview of what's going on. All right. Wan Ying, how's it going? Yes, we don't have school until the 31st. That is correct. We're waiting to hear about how they want us to proceed, but definitely just don't worry right now. Just keep in the loop and we'll see what happens. But hopefully we'll be able to get back on track. Okay. I will also be posting some videos and things to give you guys some information while you're out. Take spring break, enjoy spring break. I'll post some the week after spring break. Okay, so let's talk about China. So we have unrest in China. The Qing dynasty is overthrown in 1911 by Sun Yat-sen, and he creates the Chinese Republic. Right now, Wan Ying, what we're doing is we're talking about World War I. I covered that first. And now we're talking about what happens in between World War I and World War II, because our next test is both wars, and it's too much information to do in one video. So that's what we're doing right now. You might have to rewind it a little bit. All right, so we're going to talk about China. Internal struggles that are going on. There are definitely some ethnic tensions. Remember, we had the Han and we had the Manchus. The Han never thought that the Manchus should actually rule. And the Manchus ruled through the Qing dynasty. So after the Qing dynasty goes away, the Han and the Manchus are kind of at odds with each other. There's also a threat of famine, because anytime a natural disaster comes, if it floods too much, they could have a famine. And the taxes in China are too low. They weren't taxing the people enough to maintain all of the infrastructure. So that's the internal struggles that are going on. We also have external struggles, which were the tensions that were between China and the rest of the world due to opium wars. And we know that spheres of influence were set up, and that there's a lot of trade and things going on with the outside world. So Sun Yat-sen does not have a very strong military, so he's not able to maintain his rule, and he will eventually give his rule over to the military leaders. They form the Chinese Nationalist Party. The Chinese Nationalist Party will rule for the next 20 years, before they will then have a war with the communists, and the communists will win, and China becomes communist. So that's kind of what's going on with China during this like in-between time, in between the wars. We also have some change and some power shift in Mexico. During the 1900s, President Diaz is in control. He, however, allows foreign investors to come in and take over some power. Most of the control at this time is in the hands of the rich. The rich make up about 1% of the population. And because of this, there is a candidate that's running against Diaz. His name is Madero. He is jailed, probably by Diaz, and as a result of that, the people are really upset. They're also upset about the land reforms and the accommodations given to foreign powers. And so a revolution starts. Diaz is defeated and sent into exile, and Mexico will adopt a new constitution in 1917. This new constitution gives land redistribution, universal suffrage, and public education. So 1917 is when all of that takes place. Hence the reason that they couldn't help Germany via the Zimmermann telegram that we talked about earlier, because they were going through their own internal strife. All right, then in 1929, we have what happens, the Great Depression. Yes, the Great Depression. So there are several causes and effects of the Great Depression that you need to know. First of all, Germany, after the war, they are going to print way too much paper money in order to try to pay those reparations that they have to pay from the war. This is going to cause inflation and the decrease of value of German money. France and Britain, they also are having a hard time paying the war loans back to the U.S. The Soviet government refuses to pay Russians' debts from World War I because they say, hey, those were the debts of the former government. They're not our debts. And in 1929, the stock market crashes and the banks fail in the United States. This brings about the Great Depression. The Great Depression is eventually going to affect the rest of the world, especially Africa, Asia, Latin America, because these places depend on imperial nations for their economy. Japan also is affected because they depend on foreign trade, and that suffers during this time. The whole world basically has very high unemployment, and international trade lowers and declines. And so it's just a very bad time. There's a lot of people out of work, a lot of people starving. They lost a lot of money when the stock market crashed. They lost money from their savings accounts when the banks failed. And so it's just a hard, hard time. My aunt, who passed away about 4 years ago, she was 105 when she passed away. She lived through the Great Depression. And as a result, she kept everything. It was amazing. Like, I went to go get some matches out of a drawer one time to light a candle. And when I opened it up, there were like 500 matchbooks that she had saved and tediously lined up all in a row. And I asked her, I was like, why are you saving all those matches? And she was like, well, you never know, when you're going to need them. And I realized it was probably because she went through the Great Depression where you didn't throw anything away because there was such a lack of items for you to get, and you just never knew what you were going to need. And so you had to keep everything. Definitely different than the world we live in, right? A lot of the stuff that we have today is disposable, and eventually, that may be a problem for us. We might have to start going back to not having disposable things. So moving on, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he is the president in the U.S. at the time. He proposes what's called the New Deal. And basically, the New Deal gets people back to work. And his idea is to get people back to work working for the government and building infrastructure like transcontinental roads and these massive highways that we have today, bridges, anything that the country needs. He basically puts Americans back to work doing that. And it definitely helps get Americans employed. Now, during this same time frame, in Russia, we just talked about what they went through. Just to give you a little bit of like cross context here, civil war in Russia ends in 1921. Lenin proposes his new economic plan, And then he dies in 1924, in which Stalin takes over and starts the collective farming. So around the 1929, when the Great Depression is happening everywhere, that's when Stalin is really ramping up that collective farming. Okay, so how do all of these things roll together and facilitate the rise of fascism? Very, very important to know this. Probably one of the most important things you're going to learn this year, because these are huge warning signs and things that you need to pay attention to in your life even today. So we know after World War I, Europe is left in shambles. It's a mess. Leaders promise to return countries to their former glory. All right, that's the key. All of these countries want to be what they used to be, especially Germany. You've got Germany who has to pay these huge amounts of reparation, and they are looked at as to blame for World War I, and they're basically like feeling really bad about themselves as a country. Hitler comes in and he says, hey, I'm going to take us back to our former glory. That's what the Germans want. And so they really start believing in him for that. All right. Also, the fascist dictators will blame specific groups for their problems. Everybody likes to blame somebody else, right? Nobody wants to take responsibility for their problems. And so this helps fascist dictators as well. Eventually, fascist dictators will become totalitarian states where they have complete control of everything. And they usually use violence and intimidation to maintain that control. So examples of this, definitely Germany and Hitler. Remember, Hitler sets out to form and to make the Aryan race. This is how you spell it. Aryan race, the perfect race in his opinion. Light-skinned, European, blonde hair, blue eyes. Even though he wasn't blonde hair and blue-eyed, he still thought that that was the perfect race and eventually wanted to get the whole world to look like that. He blames the Jews for Germany's problems. He also blames handicapped people, homosexuals, basically any fringe groups that he doesn't really like. All right, they're also thrown into that mix, but the Jews were the big target. One of the reasons that the Jews were such a big target is because for the most part, the Jews were just kind of easy to target because of anti-Semitism, because of not liking the Jews, because they killed Jesus. And so Christians looked at them kind of negatively anyway. And then when you have a leader coming in and saying, hey, the reason we lost is because the Jews were working with the communists. The Jews were working with the United States, and they were working against us. And that's why the Jews have been so wealthy and progressive, and they've been able to survive because they were working with the other side. Because at the time, there were a lot of Jews that were lawyers and doctors and prominent members of society. So easy targets for Hitler. So he starts to pass anti-Semitism laws, which basically will divide the Jews into that outside group. Like, you're not a part of this group. You have to sit on this bench. You can't sit on that bench. We're going to separate you. Now, if you hear anything from this video tonight, remember this. That is a huge warning sign that something bad is going to happen when a government starts to separate people. This happens in every single genocide that's happened since the Holocaust. People are separated. And it's a huge warning sign, because if people would have been paying attention, they might have been able to prevent genocides. For example, in Rwanda, the Tutsis and the Hutus were separated with an identification on their identification card. If people would have been paying attention to that and said, hey, this is what Hitler did, this could be a problem, it might have been avoided. So very important to pay attention to that. So he uses these anti-Semitism laws to discriminate against the Jews, and he also starts to push the Germans to think that, hey, we need more living space. We need to conquer more land and get that land for ourselves and to build this Aryan race. All right, those were his ideas. Now, not only do we have Hitler at this time, we also have Mussolini in Italy. Here's how you spell his name. Make sure I spell it right here. Mussolini is the fascist dictator in Italy. And Italy doesn't really gain very much after World War I. They're supposed to get land for fighting with the Allies, but they don't. And they're very discontented about that. They use propaganda in order to get public opinion, public approval towards Mussolini. And they will eventually form an alliance with Hitler in hopes of dominating all of Europe with him eventually. Mussolini also has rule through intimidation. He has the brown shirts, which are like his private army of intimidation to keep people in line. Hitler has something similar. They're called the Gestapo and the SS. So both of them are going to use those strategies in order to keep people in line. Then in Spain, we have the Spanish Civil War. The Spanish Civil War is basically between democracy and fascism. General Franco is in charge of the insurgents that he eventually will win and put himself as dictator, fascist dictator, in charge of Spain. He is helped by Germany, Italy, and Portugal to win that war, even though they weren't supposed to technically do this due to treaties after World War I, but they did anyway. A big controversial thing that happens during this time, during the Civil War in Spain, is the massacre of Guernica. That's how you spell it. And this was one of the first times in history that civilians were targeted. It was a small town that the Germans and Italians bombed, killing a lot of civilians in the Basque region of Spain. This is how you spell that, the Basque region. So Franco ends up winning, and he will rule as dictator from 1936 to 1939. Now, Spain doesn't ever officially join World War II. However, it does help the Central Powers throughout the war. You really need to check out this book. It's called Fountains of Silence, and it is a fiction book, so it's not true, but it's based on truth. And the author does such an amazing job weaving history into it. I read it in like 3 days because it was so good. I actually have a copy if any of you guys want to borrow it. But it's about Spain during the time of Franco, and it's very interesting what he was doing. He was kind of doing similar things that Hitler was doing, in that he was trying to build up a population that would continue to support him. And he did this by taking babies from people who had given birth in hospitals, telling them that these babies had died, and giving them to people who would raise them in a way that he wanted them to be raised. Crazy. Hitler did almost the same thing. It was just a little different. It was called the Lebensborn Project, where he had Aryan women giving birth to Aryan babies that he had handpicked the men and the women to be Aryan, and they teamed up, got pregnant, and had these babies. And then these babies were handed over to the government to be educated in Nazi philosophy, so that eventually when they were raised up, Hitler would already have an army. I mean, just crazy what these guys were doing and getting away with. All right, so that's Spain. Also, Brazil, we have this slow shift from agricultural to industry in Brazil. And there's a guy named Vargas who basically takes control, and he begins taking away political freedoms. He begins government censorship, and he believes that the superiority of one's nation over others was like the most important thing. He's a hyper-nationalist is what the word is. So basically saying that his culture is superior over everyone else, and he wanted to only promote their national interest, basically. And he did not, however, use violence to maintain control. He was able to maintain control without that. So we have all these examples of fascist leaders you might want to remember, because you might be asked questions about them later. All right, then we have propaganda being used, and it's used very similarly throughout all of these fascist dictatorships, but basically it's complete control of everything that a person reads or sees or hears. The Nazis were brilliant at propaganda. They were in control of everything. They had films. So if you were going to go to the movie theater, you would see a film that was Nazi propaganda. There's one that I saw on the History Channel. They have a movie about it. It's called The Nazi Titanic. And the hero was a Nazi. The Nazis didn't even exist during the time of the Titanic. So that was really interesting. And if you can catch that on the History Channel, it's super interesting to watch. They were also in charge of the radio. They were in charge of posters hanging around town. I mean, everywhere you went, you could not get away from this propaganda. Most of the posters are going to show Hitler and Stalin as like the father figure, and the children that are in the posters are very happy, like the father of the nation kind of thing. And they also are going to demonize the enemy. So all these propaganda posters that you see, the enemy will look really, really bad, like really mean. Okay. Now remember, this was also a time that you couldn't just go to the internet and look something up. And so people were very easily swayed, especially children. And in Germany, all the teachers that refused to teach Nazi theory, they're gotten rid of, and the Nazis come in and they start teaching school. And they start teaching the children. So now when you're doing a math problem, you are tallying up how much money Germany would save if they got rid of all the handicapped people. You're reading books about how to find the Jew, how to know who the Jew is. And in these books, the Jew, of course, looks really, really bad, like really mean and really suspicious. And so all of these things are leading up to World War II. If you are asked to write a context about World War II, any of the things that we talked about in between, the in-between years, could be context of World War II, because it all leads up to that, which we will talk about in our next video. So if you have any questions, ask me real quick. If not, we are going to hop off of here and we get to sleep in tomorrow. I'm super excited about that. Next video, we'll talk about World War II. That starts in 1939, and we'll talk about the effects of that in that video as well. So if you don't have any quick questions, I'm going to hop off of here. Thank you so much for stopping by and hanging out with me tonight. I really appreciate the watch time. Let me tell you. Thank you, Aryan. I appreciate you tuning in, and Wan Ying, I appreciate you guys so much. I hope that you have a great evening. Take these notes and make some flashcards, all right? That's what I want you to do. Take the notes, put like Hitler's name on the front, and then everything I told you about him on the back. And do flashcards with all this information. That way you can take those flashcards with you everywhere you go. When you get 10 minutes free, flip through those flashcards. Memorize this information. When I read your LEQs, it's that you don't have enough information. So memorize this stuff. You guys can do it. We're so close to the exam. Keep up with the good work, and we'll get you guys to that exam and hopefully get you to pass it. All right. Good night, everybody. Have an awesome night, and I will talk to you soon.